Thanks very much, Annie. And if you read Annie's brilliant biography of Lord Dufferin, I strongly recommend it to you. I'm delighted to welcome my colleague from the History Department at Maynooth University, Dr. Jonathan Wright, to the stage. And Jonathan's paper this evening is The Museum and Mocha Collecting Empire in Early 19th Century Belfast. Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Terry. And Danny, I'd like to start by thanking the conference organisers for putting this excellent and very timely event together. And I'd like personally to thank particularly Bryony Widdis for encouraging me to come along and to participate and encouraging me to revisit some research that I conducted a number of years ago now. In keeping with the theme of this panel, stories and histories of collecting, memorialising and forgetting, the story I want to tell, or this evening I think it now is a story about collecting. To be precise, what I want to talk about is the development of the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society's museum collection and the role of empire or imperial connections in facilitating that. Story about forgetting is another matter. When I was first working on this material about a decade ago now, I would have said very emphatically that it seemed to me in the early 2010s that the whole question of the culture of empire upon Ireland was one that had been neglected in favour of what Stephen Howard termed the bad question. That is to say, was Ireland a colony? It seemed that, to use the conceptualisation of Catherine Hall and Sonia Rose, the ways in which empire was encountered at home in Ireland had changed. I think now that situation is changing. If the bad question still receives the occasional, largely fruitless airing, more nuanced stories of Ireland's imperial entanglements are thankfully now being brought into sharper focus, and I would say that this conference itself stands as a significant marker of that. Having said all that by way of preamble, let me turn now to the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society. Some of you will, I'm sure, be familiar with this organisation. For those who aren't, what we're dealing with here is a local scientific society set up in Belfast in the year 1821. It's established by a group of 7 young men of the middling classes. You can see their names on the slide, who are led and inspired by an 8th man, Dr. James Lawson Drummond, very much the kind of ominous grease behind the society. The professor and physiology in the recently established Belfast Academical Institution, and who served as the first president of the society. Now, it has to be said, there's nothing particularly exciting or noteworthy in any of this. What we're seeing here is an entirely typical phenomenon: the middling classes in the early 19th century setting up societies. This is what they did. They did it in Belfast, they did it in Manchester, Glasgow, Newcastle, where you had people they organised. That's what this is. What marks this society out, though, are 2 things. First, there is its longevity. At a time when numerous other similar societies in Belfast are established, only to quickly wither on the vine, the Natural History and Philosophical Society survives. It remains in existence to this day. Secondly, though, significant for our purposes this evening, it establishes a museum. Now, the desire to establish a museum predated the formation of a society. In 1820, Lawson Drummond had published a pamphlet, the title of which is here, one of those nice, long 19th century titles, which tells you in the title what it actually does in the pages. Thoughts on the study of natural history and on the importance of attaching museums to the productions of nature to national seminaries of education. This was basically a plea to his bosses in the to let him set up a museum. They didn't. But it's no surprise the society that he helps kind of inspire when 21 very quickly its attentions to collecting. As the Society did a committee to consider the storage of what was already as its museum. That was a collection of botanic, conchological, mineralogical, ornithological and entomological specimens. And in subsequent years, collections would grow very, very quickly. By 1824, accordingly, new storage cases were purchased. By 1826, they had been filled. More were duly ordered. They too were quickly filled. Tentative planning for the construction of purpose-built homes was underway. In the we know today as the Old Belfast Museum, located on College Square North, and which was formally opened on the 1st of November 1831. And what you can see on the slide here is a contemporary illustration of the Old Belfast Museum. Now, visitors who passed through the doors of the museum in November 1831 could view an already impressive collection. It was said to include, as you can see here on the slide, minerals, a nearly complete collection of native and a considerable number of foreign, 200 native and foreign birds, about 3,000 insects, an extensive hortificus of indigenous, American and other exotic plants, about 200 snakes and lizards with some skins, coins, antiquities and miscellaneous articles. And there'll be more on those miscellaneous articles anon. As the would continue to grow, actually be passed on to the municipal authority, it would find a home in this building. And in this way, the museum we're standing in right now is a kind of institutional descendant of the museum I'm talking about right now. It's not my purpose today to provide an institutional history of the museum, though I might note in passing that there is a gap in the market for intellectual history of that museum comparable to that which Shara Murphy has recently produced for Dublin's 19th century Natural History Museum. Instead, though, what I want to do is look a little bit more closely at how these collections developed. Now, work on comparable scientific societies that were established in Scotland and England in the early 19th century has strayed to which they emphasised local collecting when they put together their museums. What they were was developing systematic and comprehensive collections that illustrated local natural history. That was the name of the game. Collections that too readily embraced the non-local or the foreign, viewed with suspicion. They were viewed as unscientific throwbacks, the earlier ages cabinets of curiosities. In Belfast, however, it's very clear that from the earliest moment, things were different. And Natural History and Philosophical Society were certainly interested in the natural history of their immediate surroundings, but it's clear too that they were willing, indeed they were strikingly keen, to look at developing their collections. Speaking of in May 1826, Dix Hinks, it's within the past year, material had been received from what he described as such distant countries as Norway, New Brunswick, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, South Carolina, Gibraltar, Demon's Land, Madagascar, and New South Wales. He reported that relationships of exchange had been established both with private individuals and societies, from which, as he put it, much advantage has already been derived. So at this early point, the society is already looking outward. And they move towards formalising this outward-looking collection when they prepared a printed circular due to, as it puts it, directing to this society the attention of our countrymen abroad. And encouraging them to send specimens and objects, both illustrative of natural history and of human cultures, back to Belfast. Detailed instructions were provided which specimens could be best preserved, including scorpions, lizards, and serpents. botanical specimens that people residing abroad, but particularly in tropical climate, possess the means of furnishing innumerable interesting specimens in this department, since not only the plants themselves, but their flowers, leaves, fruits, seeds, seed vessels and woods all supply useful materials for a museum. So far from being resisted, what was in fact being embraced here was a collecting policy that I've characterised elsewhere as global. But what accounts for this global perspective, or this willingness to look outward? Writing in 1820, in his pamphlet, Thoughts on the Study of Natural History, James Lawson Drummond had predicted that a museum established in Belfast would, as he puts it, soon become rich in specimens, noting that the situation and circumstances of Belfast, as a great commercial town, are highly favourable to the acquirement of the productions of every latitude, from the shores of the north to the plains of India. In short, Drummond recognised the density of Belfast's links with the wider world. The obvious form of connection was, of course, via trade, with North America and the Caribbean being notably well developed. But there were that would have been very visible to a man like Drummond as well. As I've noted, Drummond taught in the Belfast Academical Institution, which had opened in 1814. This institution had been funded by public subscriptions, several of which were received from individuals who were resident in Jamaica. More strikingly, one A.J. McCann of Calcutta proposed that a subscription should be established in support of the school among British and Irish expatriates in India. That subscription eventually netted the school the sum of £5,000. In 1819, Belfast's Harp Society was also helped out of financial difficulties when funds of so-called India money were received from Ulstermen resident in India. If we turn away from funding, imperial connections were made visible in a more direct sense by the presence in the Belfast Academical Institution of students from Jamaica. And this was by no means a new or an unprecedented thing, because students, both black and white, hailing from the Caribbean and India, had earlier been accommodated in a longer established Belfast school, the Belfast Academy. Now, there are a whole range of other examples I could give here, illustrative of Belfast's connections with empire in the early 19th century, but at this point, the argument I'm making should, I think, be clear. What we have in Belfast is a town with myriad links to empire, and this was reflected in the collecting policy that was pursued by the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society. Now, whatever that shaped it, the practice adopted by the Natural History and Philosophical Society has led to a firm archival footprint, which we can trace in its donation book, that is, its records of material received, and in its outgoing letter book. In January 1828, for instance, the Society contacted James McGee, a Belfast man who was travelling to Trinidad, and requested by forwarding, when convenient, contributions of whatever kind may occur to you as proper to send. From the donation book, it appears that McGee obliged for at different dates with fruit grown at Trinidad, a collection of fossils, shells, seed vessels and corals, and a specimen of a small tortoise. Likewise, in June 1829, was made with Charles Telfair, a Belfast-born naval surgeon who was based in Mauritius, and an important relationship of exchange was established. In addition to geological specimens, Telfair supplied seeds which were cultivated in Belfast's recently established botanic gardens, and he attempted in 1831 to send 2 live baboons to Belfast, attempted being the operative word. Both of them died en route to the town. Quite what the Society would have done with them if they had arrived in the fullness of health is not recorded in the archive. McGee and Telfair are simply 2 examples, for between 1821 and that's the period when the records are actually the most complete for the Society, the Natural History and Philosophical Society received some 570 donations. Donations ranging from single items to extended assignments of objects and specimens, for weapons and ammunition with which to obtain further heads in a spiral of escalating violence, which came to a head only once all the tribes had firearms. But whatever might be said about the circumstances in which the Natural History and Philosophical Society's Moko Mokai was acquired, its presence, of course, serves to highlight the fact that the collecting of artefacts could be a less than benign process, and it invites us to consider the extent to which the Natural History and Philosophical Society participated in a practice, the representation of others to domestic audiences, that was bound with the wider processes of coercion, violence and control that went hand in hand with the expansion and maintenance of imperial power. Now, it could of course be objected that I'm placing too great a weight of interpretation on a single object, the provenance of which is unclear. That might be fair, but, and it's a big but, the Moko Mokai that was received in May 1829 is far from being the only item the Society acquired which directs our attention to the linkages between the collection of artefacts and the exercise of imperial power. In its annual reports and in its donation book, we encounter references to the Society's receipt during its first 10 years of existence to samples of statuary, elephanta, to indigenous American weaponry, to consignment of Polynesian artefacts, including cloth samples from Tahiti, and what is described as a New Zealand war club and belt. In the months following the museum building, in November 1831, a Burmese idol and an Indian manuscript were received. So too was an Eskimo canoe, while a Captain John M. Boys of the 38th Madras Native Infantry forwarded what was described as a Burmese god. Now, the fact that Boys served native infantry is, of course, significant. Military officers were well placed to collect, i.e. to loot, and circulate artefacts. Equally well placed were naval, and we have very clear evidence of the Natural History and Philosophical Society's attempts to establish links with naval officers. The Society's minutes for the 7th of December 1825, for instance, detailed the election as a corresponding member of Surgeon William Wright of the Royal Navy, while the for 1831 to 1831 urged members to continue gain additional specimens for the collection, appealing in particular to those who have friends in the Royal Navy on any of the foreign stations. And these attempts to exploit naval networks were no doubt connected to the biographical particulars of the Society's father figure, James Lawson Drummond, who earlier in his life had served as a naval surgeon, spending time at the Mole in Gibraltar, where he developed an expertise in Mediterranean birdlife. An expertise that he later shared with William Thompson, fellow member of the Natural History and Philosophical Society, of a monumental 4-volume Natural History of Ireland, published between 1849 and 1856, in which he included some of Drummond's information in anecdotal form. However, Thompson did not need to rely on the older man's tales, because he too had naval connections and had spent time in the Mediterranean himself. In 1841, he sailed on HMS Beacon, a surveying ship that was tasked with charting the Aegean, and that was captained by one Thomas Grave, who had earlier supplied the Natural History and Philosophical Society with artefacts from Africa. So you can begin to see how these networks develop and this kind of circularity in how knowledge is being acquired and exchanged. So particularly naval networks were thus facilitating the Natural History and Philosophical Society's gathering of specimens and artefacts. And this was a dynamic that continued on into the second half of the 19th century. And in the 1850s, the Belfast-born writer and parliamentarian James Emerson Tennant, who was referred to earlier, and who had spent a dismal 5 years as a colonial secretary in Ceylon, supplied the Society with entomological specimens, shells, and a whole range of ethnographic objects, including this rather fearsome-looking chap, an ornate, if rather frightening, Kolum dancer's mask depicting the snake demon Nagara, which remains to this day on display in the museum. You can go and look at it in the windows to the world gallery. I was going to say this is a very popular exhibition with my children. It's not popular, but when they were younger, I used to drag them along and terrify them with it, which probably tells you more about my parenting style than anything else. So this process continues on in the 19th century. But by the 1860s, there's a kind of a sense in which the mood is beginning to change in the society. And there are signs that its members began to reconsider the kind of earlier outward-looking curatorial policy. Indeed, they began to be embarrassed that their local collections didn't quite stack up favourably alongside their overseas collections. Now, I'm not going to read this out in full or analyse it in full. You'll no doubt be pleased to hear. But what I want to do is highlight just a couple of passages from this section from the annual report History Society from 1867 to 1868, in particular the bits where they talk about how the materials that have been collected have been the main aim of conveying pleasure and information to thousands. And the bit where they talk about entertaining the hope that they may be able, through future modifications, to utilise these specimens further by some more systematic arrangement. Because in closing, this brings me to what is really the most important question in thinking about how this appears as a kind of a way of encountering empire at home. And that is, how is this stuff actually disposed of within the museum? How is it arranged and how is it encountered? We know a good deal about what the society possesses. We know a good deal less about how it organises it, okay? But in simple terms, that what happens is that the exhibitions are differentiated very clearly in the museum between the foreign and the domestic. So that kind of jumble that Annie was talking about that you get in Dufferin and Ava's collection, with kind of things from Ireland and things from overseas rubbing together side by side in the Museum of the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society. Now, the evidence that we have is very limited. We're kind of reading between the lines, but just to give you kind of a few examples from visitors' guides and pamphlets dating from the late 19th century, it appears that there is this very sharp distinction being drawn. So, for example, Irish antiquities were located in the bed, whereas what might be described as overseas antiquities were housed in a separate ethnology room, which was said in 1893 to, and I'm quoting here, throw light on the habits and modes of life of many savage and semi-civilized races. And this really kind of draws to the crux of what you get emerging within the museum. In its early years, the kind of individuals who were involved in the museum were influenced very much by kind of a Paley-esque idea of natural theology. And the idea there is that mankind, whatever their differences, were all part of God's family, that all productions of nature were part of God's creation and could be looked upon as a whole. By the time you get to the late 19th century, I think what you begin to get emerging very, very clearly is a very stark dichotomy between that kind of typically imperial dichotomy between civility and barbarism, with the kind of the foreign, particularly the ethnological artifacts being presented in such a way as to illustrate what are perceived at the time as being lesser stages of civilizational development. And that rubs alongside a sort of exoticizing impulse as well, which you can kind of get something out of from this flyer, which is advertised to the working classes on Easter Monday. The museum was opened up to the working classes, the idea being that it's much better that they come and walk around the museum and go to Cave Hill and get drunk. They present where they want to kind of draw attention to the exhibits they have that are big and showy. That's the kind of language they use elsewhere. So on this occasion, they're boasting that they have two jerboas that people can come and look at. But what this all means, and I'll conclude on this, is that what we have in Belfast, in the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Societies Museum, is an institution that is facilitated in its development by empire, by imperial connections, but that also stands within Belfast as a space of empire, in which people can come and encounter the different cultures that are encompassed within British imperial power. And that's very significant, because how within the museum is they encounter them ordered, organised, controlled according to the dictates of Western knowledge. John M. Mackenzie is not a historian I agree with in terms of he says, but I agree with him in relation to museums when he talks about how museums were a central part of ordering the world, familiarising and naturalising the unknown as the known, and bringing the remote and unfamiliar into concordance with the zone of prior knowledge, both geographically and intellectually. In Belfast, the 19th century, the Natural History and Philosophical Societies Museum, I would contend, did precisely this, and as such stands as a quintessential institution of empire. Thank you very much.